What would you do if the person everyone in the room was laughing at turned out to be the only one who could actually save a life? Because that is exactly what happened on the 14th day of Elena Marsh's contract at Ridgemont Veterans Hospital. And by the time the sun went down that day, nobody in that building was laughing anymore. Before we go further, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me which city you are watching from tonight, and subscribe if you have not already, because this story only gets heavier from here, and you do not want to miss where it goes. Elena Marsh walked through the staff entrance of Ridgemont Veterans Hospital at 5:40 in the morning, exactly the way she had walked through it every morning for the past 2 weeks. She wore plain gray scrubs, carried a small backpack instead of a purse, and kept her hair pulled back so tightly that it looked almost painful. She did not wear a lanyard covered in pins. She did not decorate her badge. She looked in every visible way like a woman who wanted to be forgotten the moment you stopped looking directly at her. That was not an accident. That was a skill, one she had spent years building. Though nobody on the 3rd floor of Ridgemont knew that yet, and most of them were not interested enough to wonder. She had come to Ridgemont through a staffing agency, a short-term placement to cover a gap in the medical surgical unit. Her paperwork was clean. Her license checked out. Her references answered the phone when called and said reasonable things. Nobody dug deeper than that, because nobody at a mid-size veterans hospital in a quiet Colorado town had any reason to. A contract nurse was a contract nurse. You gave her the schedule, you gave her the difficult patients nobody else wanted, and you waited to see if she cracked under the pressure, or made it to the end of her contract in one piece. The charge nurse on Elena's floor was a heavy-set, sharp-eyed woman named Bernice Cole, who had worked at Ridgemont for 12 years and had, in that time, developed an almost supernatural instinct for sizing up new hires within the first week. Bernice did not like quiet people. Quiet people, in her experience, were either terrified or hiding something, and either way, they were trouble waiting to happen. On day 4, she cornered Elena at the nurse's station, and told her plainly that she was being watched. Elena had simply nodded and said, "Understood," and gone back to her charting. There was no argument in her, no attempt to defend herself, and that unsettled Bernice more than a fight would have. If this story has already pulled you in, do me a favor and smash that subscribe button, because I promise you the next 15 minutes are going to be worth every second. And if you are new here, comment the word helicopter, so I know you made it this far, because that word is going to matter a lot very soon. The hospital's chief of trauma surgery was a broad-shouldered, silver-haired man named Dr. Bruce Halden, 61 years old, the kind of man who had been the loudest voice in every room he had entered for 30 years, and had never once questioned whether that was a good thing. Halden decided within the first week that Elena Marsh was not competent, and once he decided something, he did not revisit it. He began routing the hardest patients toward her, not because he believed she could handle them, but because he wanted a paper trail proving she could not. He called her the temp in front of residents. Once, in the hallway outside the supply room, loudly enough for 3 nurses to hear, he called her clinical judgment guesswork. Elena absorbed every one of these moments without visible reaction, which somehow made the comments sting less for her and land harder for everyone who witnessed them. On day 7, Halden assigned her a patient who had already gone through 2 other nurses that week, a man with a documented history of throwing things at staff who tried to touch him. Elena walked into that room, pulled a chair to the bedside instead of standing at a clinical distance, and talked to him quietly for almost 20 minutes. By the time she left, he had eaten half his breakfast and agreed to let her check his dressing. She did not mention this to anyone. She simply updated his chart and moved to her next patient. And the nurses who had been watching through the door glass said nothing to each other, because nobody wanted to be the first to admit they were surprised. On day 11, a patient went into cardiac arrest during a chaotic shift change, the kind of moment where half the floor is technically off duty and nobody is sure who is supposed to be doing what. Elena was the first person through the door. By the time the attending physician arrived 90 seconds later, she already had the situation under control. Her voice calm, her instructions to the nursing assistant short and exact. The attending later told her she had probably bought the patient 2 extra minutes that mattered. Elena said only, "He's stable now," and returned to her other patients. She made no friends that day, but she also made no enemies. And the nurses who had expected her to fail quietly stopped expecting that, and started watching for something else instead. Something they could not yet name. If you are the kind of person who needs to know how a story ends before you can relax, then good news, because the ending here is worth it, but you have to stick with me. And the easiest way to make sure you do not lose this video in your feed is to tap subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because this channel posts stories exactly like this one every single week. On day 19, Bernice handed Elena a new assignment without looking up from her clipboard. Room 318, she said. Combative patient. Deaf. Refused 4 nurses already this week. Good luck. She did not turn immediately. She processed the sentence the way she had been trained to process dangerous information, without letting her face show a flicker of it, and then she turned and asked how much time they had. He held up 3 fingers. She nodded once, took the chart under her arm, and walked out into the corridor as if nothing at all had happened. 20 minutes later, Dr. Halden found her at the nurse's station, and made a show of asking why she had spent nearly an hour with a flagged patient without backup present. Elena told him plainly that the patient's infection markers were elevated beyond what the current treatment should allow, that the wound had visibly spread overnight, and that she had documented everything for the attending to review. Halden reminded her, with the particular weight of a man who believed his title settled every argument, that she was a temporary contract nurse and did not get to reinterpret behavioral flags. She looked at him directly and said she had only documented what she observed, and that the attending could make the clinical call. He told her to watch herself and walked away. Bernice, who had witnessed the entire exchange from a distance, said nothing, but she started actually reading Elena's documentation instead of skimming it, and that quiet shift mattered more than either of them realized yet. The rest of the morning moved the way ordinary hospital mornings do. Elena administered medications, helped an elderly veteran with a complicated dressing on his forearm, and sat for 10 minutes with a man who had been crying quietly since the overnight shift and had told 3 other nurses he was fine. She did not ask if he was fine. She simply sat with him until his breathing steadied. And then she told him she would be back later, and she was. Nothing about her morning looked remarkable to anyone watching. And that, she had learned a long time ago, was the most important skill of all. If you want more stories like this one, the kind that start slow and quiet and then absolutely do not let go of you, subscribe now and turn on the bell, because I post a brand new one every single week, and I do not want you to miss the next one. At 11:14, the call came from room 318, not through the official call button, but through a specific rhythmic knock Elena had noticed Walter using earlier, one that the nurse's station had dismissed as mechanical noise from a loose bed rail. She was inside the room in under 2 minutes. Walter was upright, his breathing labored in a way it had not been 2 hours earlier, his skin taking on a gray undertone, one side of his chest rising less fully than the other. Elena assessed him in seconds. She stepped into the hallway and called for a physician, stating clearly that this was respiratory compromise, not anxiety, and needed immediate attention. She went back inside and checked his oxygen levels, which were dropping fast, and she recognized immediately what she was looking at. A collapsing lung, pressure building inside his chest, slowly pushing everything else out of place. This had not developed in the last hour. It had been building since at least that morning. Dr. Halden arrived 3 minutes later, which felt like 30. Elena told him flatly that this was a tension pneumothorax, and that the patient needed immediate decompression. Halden looked at the monitor, looked at Walter, and suggested imaging first to confirm the diagnosis before doing anything invasive. Elena told him there was no time for imaging and pointed out the visible shift in his windpipe, clear evidence that confirmed exactly what she was saying. Halden, invoking his title and his tenure, ordered her to step back and stop overriding physician judgment. Elena looked at Walter. Walter looked at her. His oxygen levels kept falling. She reached past Halden, retrieved what she needed from the supply cart, positioned herself at the correct point on his chest, and performed the decompression herself. The room heard the hiss of trapped air releasing. Walter's oxygen numbers, which had been sliding for several minutes straight, paused, then began climbing, first slowly and then with real confidence. His breathing evened out. His color started to return. Dr. Halden stood frozen while a nursing assistant pressed herself against the far wall in shock. Elena stepped back, disposed of the needle properly, and began documenting the exact time and nature of the intervention, as if this were any other Tuesday. Okay, before this next part, I need you to comment your honest reaction right now, because what happens in the next 2 minutes changes literally everything about this story, and I promise you it is worth pausing to like this video before you keep scrolling further into the chaos. Walter, still shaking from the physiological stress of what had just happened, raised his right hand and signed 2 words to Elena, low and close to his body where Halden could not fully see the motion. She signed back just as quietly. I know. Stay still. Halden, finding his voice again, announced that Elena had just performed an unsanctioned medical procedure and was suspended, effective immediately, and that security would escort her from the building. Elena, without raising her voice, told him his patient's oxygen was at 92 and climbing, that she had documented the entire intervention, and that she recommended a surgical consult within the next 30 minutes. Then she finished writing in the chart, set it down, and said she would wait in the break room. As she stepped into the corridor, she heard it before she understood it. A low vibration traveling through the floor and up into the light fixtures. The windows at the end of the hallway began to rattle gently in their frames. Somebody near the nurse's station stood up and looked toward the ceiling. Then the sound resolved into something unmistakable. Rotor blades, multiple aircraft, coming in low and fast from the north. The first military helicopter crossed the tree line above Ridgemont Veterans Hospital, and every window in that corridor lit up white with the wash of its searchlight against the pale morning sky. 2 more followed behind it. In the parking lot below, black vehicles began arriving in tight formation, doors opening before the wheels had fully stopped. Every nurse, every visitor, every staff member near a window that morning stood in complete silence, because there was simply nothing left to say. Elena stood at the junction near the fire door, one hand resting on the push bar, not moving toward the stairwell, not moving away from it either. She was not watching the helicopters. She was watching the entrance below, where the first figures were already moving through the automatic doors with badges out, already knowing exactly where they were headed. And they were headed for the 3rd floor. They were headed for room 318. If you have made it this far into the story, you already know this channel is worth subscribing to, so go ahead and do that now, and drop a comment telling me who you think is actually in charge of what just walked through those hospital doors, because the answer is not what you are expecting. They came through the main entrance in a tight formation of 4 people, moving with the specific economy of people who have already decided exactly what they are doing, and are only working out who needs to get out of their way fastest. In front was a compact woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a charcoal suit, a badge clipped visibly to her chest pocket. Behind her walked 3 men in plain clothes that did nothing to disguise the posture underneath them. The front desk officer stood and asked them to check in. The woman held up her badge without breaking stride. Special Agent Naomi Cross, Defense Criminal Investigative Service. I need your 3rd floor right now. The officer looked at the badge, looked at the helicopters still visible through the front windows, and sat back down without another word. They took the stairs 2 at a time. At the nurse's station, the unit clerk had her phone halfway to her ear when Agent Cross appeared at the top of the landing and told her flatly not to call anyone, that she needed the room number for a patient named Walter Briggs and the nurse who had just been suspended. The clerk gave both without hesitation. Elena was still standing at the fire door junction, exactly where she had been when the helicopters first appeared overhead. She had not moved toward room 318. She had not moved toward the exit. She stood with her arms folded, watching the corridor, and when Agent Cross turned the corner and saw her, she stopped walking for exactly 1 second before continuing forward. Elena Marsh, she said. That's the name on my badge, Elena replied evenly. We need to talk. But first, you need to know that patient in 318 had a collapsed lung less than an hour ago. He's stable now, but he is not cleared for anything stressful. Keep it short. Agent Cross studied her for a long moment, the particular measuring look of someone who has spent a career reading people under pressure and has learned to trust the things that do not move. You know why we're here, she said. I have a reasonable idea, Elena answered. We'll start there. Quick reminder before we go further, if this story is hitting different for you right now, drop a like, share it with someone who loves a slow burn thriller, And subscribe so you never miss the next one, because what happens in that consultation room next is going to reframe everything you just watched. They stepped into a small family consultation room just off the nurse's station and closed the door. Agent Cross asked directly how long Elena had known Walter was inside this hospital. Elena answered honestly that she had been assigned to him that same morning. Nothing more, nothing less, though her tone made it clear there was more underneath that answer that she was not yet offering freely. Cross pulled a folded federal authorization document from her jacket and set it on the table between them without pushing it forward. Elena recognized the seals at the top from a life she had not operated in for years. Cross explained in careful, measured sentences that her team had spent nearly 2 years investigating a procurement fraud network, corrupt defense contractors who had falsified safety certifications for prosthetic and assistive equipment distributed through veteran hospitals across several states. The fraud, she said, had already caused a documented string of preventable injuries and at least 3 confirmed deaths among veterans who had received compromised equipment. Walter Briggs, she explained, had been quietly carrying physical evidence hidden inside the housing of his prosthetic leg for months, waiting for a safe contact he could trust to move it forward. That's why his infection was left untreated for so long, Elena said, not as a question but as a conclusion she had already half reached on her own. Cross confirmed it. A culture result from his previous admission months earlier should have triggered a specific antibiotic course. It had been quietly delayed long enough for the infection to worsen, and he had been discharged before the correct treatment was ever completed. Someone inside this hospital had deliberately let his condition deteriorate. If you want to know who that person turns out to be, and trust me, it is worse than you think, make sure you are subscribed right now, because the next part of this story moves fast, and I do not want you missing a single detail of it. The hospital administrator, a thin, precise man named Frank Doss, arrived on the 3rd floor at almost exactly the moment Cross's team began pulling security footage from the corridor. Doss demanded to understand the legal basis for a federal team operating inside his hospital. Cross handed him a copy of the warrant without looking up from her laptop screen, and told him plainly that he was named in the supporting documents as a witness for now. Doss's jaw tightened, but his hands did not shake. He was a man with a great deal of practice at composure. He said he would need to contact legal counsel. Cross told him that was fine, but that he should stay below the 2nd floor, and should not contact Dr. Halden before her team had a chance to speak with him first. Doss left, but he did not head toward the lobby. He turned left, toward the administrative corridor, instead of right toward the stairwell. Elena, standing near the nurse's station, noticed which direction he went and quietly mentioned it to Agent Cross, who immediately sent one of her agents to follow. Inside room 318, Walter Briggs was sitting upright, notebook open, writing in dense, careful lines. When Elena entered, he looked up with the sharp focus of a man who had already mentally moved several steps past the crisis of the morning. He signed that he had been documenting everything, names, dates, a full timeline, and that it needed to reach the right people. Elena told him it would. Then she asked him directly about the leg. He pulled back the sheet to reveal the prosthetic, a more substantial unit than the standard model, with reinforced housing panels above the knee. Inside the posterior panel, he explained, was a sealed data chip containing falsified certification documents for prosthetic devices sent through a dozen veteran hospitals, along with names, transactions, forged test results, and the internal contacts who had made the whole scheme possible. This hospital he signed was on that list. Elena asked for a name. He did not sign it. He wrote it on his notebook page instead and turned it toward her. She read it, kept her expression perfectly still, and handed the notebook back. If you are the kind of viewer who likes guessing along with the story, comment your guess for who that name belongs to right now before I confirm it. And while you are there, go ahead and hit subscribe, because I promise this channel has a lot more stories exactly like this one waiting for you. She stepped back into the corridor and found Agent Cross already walking toward her. We have a problem, Elena said. We have several, Cross replied. Which one is yours? The internal contact isn't administrative. He's clinical. It's Dr. Halden. Cross's pace did not change by much, but something behind her eyes sharpened. Elena explained that Halden had access to Walter's chart from his very first admission, that he had approved the delayed culture results months earlier, and that he had personally tried to block the emergency intervention that morning. He let him get worse on purpose, Elena said quietly. I can't prove intent, she added. But the evidence Walter is carrying names a Dr. B. Halden as the internal contact at this hospital who approved device certifications in exchange for payments routed through a medical supply subsidiary. Cross pulled her radio and gave a short instruction. 2 agents peeled off toward the physician's lounge on the second floor. Dr. Halden was found sitting alone with a cold cup of coffee, and according to the 2 people who described the scene afterward, he did not run, did not pretend confusion. He simply stood up and said with a strange kind of tired honesty, I figured it would be today. They walked him up to a hastily converted conference room on the 3rd floor. Elena was not present for that part. She was in the hallway outside room 318, working through the complicated internal accounting that comes after being right about something for weeks, and having the being right feel like nothing in particular. If this story has your full attention right now, that is exactly the reaction I am going for, so like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment the word confirmed if you saw Halden coming from a mile away. Bernice found her there a little later, holding a chart she clearly had not walked over to actually read. She said the attending had confirmed the tension pneumothorax on review, that it was in the official record now. Elena said simply, good. Bernice added quietly that without the intervention, Walter would have gone into full arrest inside 10 minutes, maybe less. Then she looked at the floor and admitted that she had put Elena in the wrong category during her very first week, that she had told people Elena was hiding something. I wasn't wrong, Bernice said. I just had the wrong idea about what. It was not an apology in the traditional sense, but it was something harder and more honest than that. An admission of miscalculation from a woman who prided herself on rarely making them. Elena told her only that she had kept reading the documentation, and that was what mattered. Bernice nodded once and walked back toward the station. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in the particular chaos that happens when a federal investigation collides with an active hospital floor. Agents extracted the data chip from Walter's prosthetic with the help of a forensic technician, and when it was scanned with a portable reader, the results immediately registered a security classification high enough to make one of the junior agents visibly step back from the table. Cross reviewed the scan with the expression of someone who had hoped for confirmation, and received it without any real satisfaction. She told Elena quietly that everything Walter had said checked out, that this hospital was the most deeply compromised of the network, and that Halden had been receiving payments since at least 2019. He was not the only one inside Ridgemont either. There were at least 3 other people connected to the scheme somewhere in the building. If you have not smashed that like button yet, now is a great time. And if you are watching this at night trying to fall asleep, comment the word insomnia, because half of my audience apparently watches these stories to relax, which honestly makes no sense given what happens next. By mid-afternoon, 2 federal agents escorted Frank Doss out of the administrative wing in a manner careful enough to avoid looking like an arrest to anyone glancing through the windows, though it did not fool the unit clerk or the 2 nursing assistants who watched with their hands over their mouths. Dr. Halden came out 20 minutes later, and that exit was far less careful about appearances. His face had gone a specific shade of gray that had nothing to do with the hallway lighting, and he walked with the deliberate stillness of a man trying very hard to keep everything from showing, which of course meant that everything was showing. He looked toward the nurse's station as he passed. He looked directly at Elena. She did not look up. She genuinely had a medication reconciliation to finish, and she was not going to leave it half done just because the moment called for a dramatic reaction. The work was the work. But when the elevator doors closed behind him, something in her chest that had been tight since 5:40 that morning finally loosened, just slightly. By 4 o'clock, 3 of the nurses who had spent weeks either ignoring Elena or quietly undermining her began approaching her with real questions, not loaded ones, but genuine clinical questions about wound protocols and documentation. She answered every one of them patiently. That too was the work. Before we go further into what happens tonight, if you enjoy stories where quiet competence eventually gets the recognition it deserves, subscribe now, because I build an entire channel around exactly that kind of story, and I do not want you missing next week's upload. Agent Cross found Elena once more before the end of the shift, in a quiet supply room that had become an unofficial safe space, since none of the staff wanted to be seen lingering near the federal agents stationed nearby. "I need to ask you something directly," Cross said. "Your placement here. The staffing agency. The contract." Elena said nothing. "We ran the agency," Cross continued. "The phone number listed as your professional reference routes through a federal communications relay. That is not a normal staffing agency." The room went very still. "You were placed here," Cross said. "Not randomly assigned. Someone positioned you in this building specifically." Elena met her eyes and said carefully that she had known there was a problem at this facility before she arrived, though not the full scope of it. "But you knew about Walter specifically," Cross said. Elena admitted that she had known someone at Ridgemont needed a safe contact, and that the verification code Walter had used that morning was a system meant for situations where normal channels had already been compromised. "Was," she corrected quietly. "Past tense." Cross studied her for a long moment, the kind of silence that in an interrogation room functions as its own kind of pressure. But she was reading something specific in Elena's stillness, not guilt, not evasion, but the particular composure of someone who has sat in rooms where silence itself was a tool. "Who sent you?" Cross finally asked. "I can't answer that here," Elena said. "Will you answer it somewhere else?" "That depends on who is asking, and in what capacity." "I am asking as the lead investigator on a federal case. Your presence may have materially changed." "Then yes," Elena said. "But not today." Cross nodded, with the slight reluctance of someone accepting a boundary she did not love but recognized as legitimate. "Go home," she said. "Be back at 7 tomorrow. We will have some ground rules to review before the morning shift starts." If your stomach just did a small flip reading that exchange, comment the emoji that best describes how you are feeling right now. And go ahead and subscribe, because tomorrow morning in this story is where everything gets far more complicated. Elena stopped at room 318 on her way out. Walter was lying back against the pillow, his oxygen numbers finally holding steady in the high 90s. His color better than it had been all day. He was not asleep. He looked up when she entered and signed simply that he had known something was different about her the moment she raised her hand and asked permission to come closer that first morning. She told him that Dr. Reyes would be handling his care overnight, and that he was in good hands. He signed that he knew. Then he asked if she was going to disappear again. Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Not yet," she signed back. She did not go straight home that night. She parked outside a closed pharmacy 3 blocks from the hospital and sat with the engine running while she read a text message on a second phone. One with no name attached, just an address in Denver and a time the next morning. She recognized the formatting immediately, a signature she had not seen in almost 4 years. The problem was not that she did not know who had sent it. The problem was that the person who had sent it was supposed to be 2 full levels removed from anything connected to Walter Briggs, and reaching out this directly, on an unsecured device, suggested one of 2 things. Either the situation had escalated beyond what normal channels could handle, or someone had compromised those channels entirely, and this was a warning. If you are hooked right now, please do me a favor and share this video with one friend who loves a slow burn conspiracy story, because that genuinely helps this channel more than you know. And subscribe while you are at it so you catch every twist coming up. At 7 that evening, Cross's team flagged a delivery van registered to a medical supply subsidiary that had been sitting motionless in the hospital's visitor lot since before the federal team ever arrived that morning. It finally moved just after 7, pulling out slowly and turning north. An agent traced the registration to a shell company with links already flagged in the broader fraud investigation. Cross ordered surveillance to keep a discreet watch. By 8:20, that same van was identified parked outside a motel 4 miles from the hospital, the exact motel where Elena had been staying during her contract. Cross called her immediately. "There's a vehicle in your lot," she said without preamble. "White van, out of state plates." "I saw it when I pulled in," Elena said calmly. "Someone's inside it," Cross said. "Pack your things. We're pulling you out." "No." Elena replied. "If I move now, they'll know we've noticed them. They'll go quiet, and we'll lose whatever they're planning to do next. How many agents do you have free tonight?" After a pause, Cross said 3. Leave 2 watching Walter, Elena said. Send 1 to the motel. Position somewhere they won't be seen from the lot. If the van moves, follow it. If anyone comes inside, I'll have enough warning. This isn't your operation, Cross said. Which operation is it then? Silence answered that question more clearly than words could have. Send your people, Elena said, and ended the call before Cross could argue further. If you are enjoying this story so far, drop a comment right now with your prediction for what happens at that motel overnight. And remember to subscribe, because I promise the next twist is not what you are expecting. The night passed at the motel without direct incident, though the absence of incident turned out to be its own kind of information. The van sat in the lot until just after 2 in the morning, then left. The agent following it lost the trail near a highway interchange, after the van doubled back through several turns clearly meant to shake pursuit. Cross called Elena at 2:20. They're gone, she said. They'll be back, Elena replied. You sound certain. They weren't here for me specifically tonight. They were confirming my location and checking for federal presence nearby. Someone will report back, and then a decision gets made about next steps. That gives us a window. A window for what? Cross asked. For whatever they're planning to do to Walter before we can move the evidence up the proper chain, Elena said. There was a pause on the line. What aren't you telling me? Cross asked. I'll be at the hospital at 6, Elena said. I said 7. I know what you said. She ended the call. She arrived at 5:51 the next morning, before the day shift had fully taken over from the overnight skeleton crew, badging in with credentials that had not yet been updated to reflect yesterday's suspension, since the administrative system was still tangled in the fallout from the previous day. She went straight to the 3rd floor. The overnight nurse, a young man named Theo, startled when she appeared through the stairwell door, and then relaxed once he recognized her. Walter's numbers had held steady all night, he told her, though his infection markers were still slightly elevated at midnight before the attending adjusted his antibiotic timing. He was awake, Theo added, and had clearly not slept at all. If you appreciate slow, careful build-up like this, subscribe now, because next week I am releasing another full-length story just like it, and I do not want you missing the notification. Inside room 318, Walter looked exactly as she expected, eyes sharp, alert in the specific way of someone trained to stay functional through sleep deprivation, though the underlying strain showed if you knew what to look for. Elena closed the door behind her and signed that a van connected to the fraud network had been outside her motel overnight. His hands tightened slightly around his notebook. They're not finished, she signed. They'll try to reach you before the evidence gets fully processed. He nodded, then signed that there was something else she needed to know. He reached under his mattress and set a second data chip on the table between them, one he had not mentioned to Cross's team the day before. Elena looked at it without touching it yet. How much do you know? Walter signed. Enough, she answered. I knew the man who built this. I didn't know he'd finished it before he died. Walter explained that his old teammate, a soldier named Danny Cole who had died in a training accident 2 years earlier, had left behind a chip hidden inside a sealed case in his personal effects, along with a handwritten note that said simply, "Don't trust the official account, and you'll know who to give this to when you find them." What was recorded on it, Walter explained, was not procurement fraud. It was a documented pattern, spanning nearly a decade, of veteran deaths quietly misclassified as accidental or natural, when in fact the medical records had been deliberately altered afterward to erase inconsistencies. The alterations all shared the same signature style, pointing toward a single coordinating hand behind them. And on the final page of his documentation, Danny Cole had written the name of the one person he trusted to carry it forward if anything ever happened to him. It was not Elena's current name, but Walter had recognized the older hand signal she had used the day before, one that did not belong to any standard sign language curriculum, and he understood exactly what that meant. People carrying that kind of history often went by more than one name. If this twist just made your stomach drop a little, comment the word "wow" right now, and please subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of layered story I build this whole channel around. Elena held the chip in her hand for 3 long seconds, then slipped it into her breast pocket. I need to make a call, she signed. Don't tell Agent Cross about this yet. Give me an hour. Walter asked why. Because what's on this chip doesn't belong under her jurisdiction. Elena signed back. If I hand it over without the right authorization chain behind it, it disappears into an interagency dispute and stays buried for another decade. He studied her for a long moment, then signed that she had clearly been quietly preparing for this moment for a long time. I was hoping I wouldn't need to, she signed back, and stepped out into the hallway. She made the call from the stairwell on a separate phone she had kept hidden in the lining of her work bag since the very first day of her placement. It connected on the third ring. The voice on the other end was a woman named Vivian Sharp, who had been Elena's operational coordinator years earlier, before Elena had officially been declared inactive. Elena explained the situation quickly. The federal investigation already underway. A second layer of evidence connected to a pattern of deliberately misclassified veteran deaths, and active surveillance already confirmed at her motel overnight. Vivian went quiet for a long moment before confirming that she had learned about a deeper connection to the fraud network just weeks earlier, which was exactly why she had sent the coded message the night before. She explained that a faction inside their old office had quietly kept the fraud network running rather than shutting it down, using the leverage it created to manage other, older secrets. Danny Cole, she said, had gotten too close to that truth, which was why his accident had never really been an accident at all. If you want to keep following this story to its end, hit subscribe right now, because what Elena discovers over the next few hours completely changes how you will see everything that happened earlier in this video. Vivian gave Elena a name, Roland Fisk, a deputy director inside a defense contractor liaison office, the man who had quietly built the entire shell network funding the fraud, buried under 3 layers of subsidiary companies, so that no standard financial check would ever connect it back to him. Fisk did not know about Elena's older operational history, Vivian explained. He believed she was simply a standard placement meant to support the ordinary procurement investigation, and he had no idea she would ever stumble onto the second, older chip. Vivian also gave Elena the contact information for a trusted line inside the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, one that had already been quietly building a separate case against Fisk for over a year, and needed exactly this kind of documentation to finally close it. You need to move today, Vivian warned. If Fisk finds out you have that chip, he will move to discredit you before he tries to recover it. He has access to your operational history. He can make it look like you went rogue, like the chip is fabricated, like your cooperation with federal agents was never authorized in the first place. He has done exactly that before. She mentioned a woman named Renata Torres, a contractor who had learned too much and had spent 3 years fighting manufactured fraud charges as a result. Elena memorized the contact details, ended the call, and sat in the stairwell for a full minute, letting the shape of the problem settle into something she could actually work with. Then she went back upstairs. If you are still with me at this point in the story, you clearly love a slow, layered thriller, so make sure you are subscribed, because the next scene is where everything comes to a head. Agent Cross was in the makeshift conference room, and she was not alone. A man in his late 50s sat across from her, wearing a suit noticeably sharper than standard field gear, with a credentials wallet already open on the table in front of him. Elena recognized the seal immediately, Defense Intelligence Liaison Office. The name on the credentials was Roland Fisk. He introduced himself smoothly, praising the remarkable work being done under difficult circumstances, and explained that he was there to help facilitate the transfer of the more sensitive evidence in this case. Evidence that required more specialized handling than standard federal custody could provide. What materials are you referring to? Elena asked evenly. A secondary data chip, Fisk said simply. Our office has been tracking Sergeant Cole's documentation for some time. For classification reasons, it needs to come to us directly rather than remain in Agent Cross's custody. Elena pointed out that the incident report describing the chip had only been filed 90 minutes earlier, and yet he had already arrived from a city nearly 2 hours away. Something behind his eyes recalibrated slightly. I'm based in Denver, he said. The drive is under 2 hours. You would have needed to leave before that report was even filed, Elena said. The room went very quiet. Fisk's tone shifted, still controlled, but with something harder underneath it now. He reminded her that the materials in question were classified at a level beyond this investigation's clearance, and that if she did not surrender them, he would be forced to flag her continued possession as unauthorized retention of classified materials, a move that would create serious problems for her cover, her record, and her cooperation status. "I'd prefer not to do that," he added. "I'd like this to end well for you. If you can feel the tension in this scene the way I can, comment the word tense right now. And subscribe, because the very next moment in this story is one of my favorite twists I have ever written for this channel." Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to Agent Cross. "I'd like to make a call in your presence," she said. Fisk objected that this was not standard procedure. "I'm addressing Agent Cross," Elena said, her voice level, simply not available to be interrupted. Cross told her to go ahead. Elena dialed the number Vivian had given her and set the phone on speaker. It rang twice before a woman answered. "Inspector General's Office, Department of Defense, Special Investigations Unit. This is Deputy Inspector General Elena Vance." The name landed differently across the room. Cross's posture shifted slightly. Fisk's jaw tightened by a fraction he clearly wished he could hide. Elena introduced herself and explained that she had in her possession a data chip containing documentation compiled by the late Sergeant Danny Cole concerning a pattern of deliberately misclassified veteran deaths over roughly 9 years, and that she also had reason to believe this documentation had been actively suppressed by a senior official inside a defense contractor liaison office. She asked to transfer custodial authority of the material directly to Deputy Vance's office. There was a brief pause on the line before Vance asked whether the individual responsible for the suppression happened to be present in the room right now. Elena looked directly at Fisk. "Yes," she said. "Don't let him leave." Vance replied that 2 agents were already 20 minutes from their location, standing by since early that morning. If your jaw just dropped a little, drop a like on this video right now, because that reaction is exactly why I make these stories, and subscribe so you catch the resolution coming up next. Fisk stood up. Agent Cross stood faster. "Sit down," she said, in the specific voice of a federal agent who was no longer making a request. He looked at the door. He made the calculation experienced people make when the exits start closing, weighing what is still possible against what is still recoverable. Then he sat back down. His expression was not the gray defeat that Halden had worn the day before. It was something else entirely. The look of a man who had operated in the gray space between authority and accountability for so long that he had genuinely stopped believing that space had an edge. He had just found it. Deputy Inspector General Vance's agents arrived within the hour and took custody of Roland Fisk in a carefully coordinated handoff with Cross's team, professionally tense but functionally smooth. The transfer of the second data chip happened in that same conference room with all 3 parties present, logged, sealed, and receipted through a paper trail that ran simultaneously to Cross's team, the Inspector General's office, and a third recipient listed only as coordinating authority, a detail nobody in the room pressed further. If you are invested in how this resolves for every single character, subscribe right now, because we are entering the final stretch of the story and I do not want you missing a second of it. Later that day, Cross sat down with Elena in the same quiet consultation room and finally asked, without any professional distance left in her voice, who Elena actually was. Elena told her the honest and incomplete truth, that her operational history was classified, but that her assignment here had only ever been to provide Walter a safe contact, recover the procurement evidence, and identify the internal hospital contacts cooperating with the fraud. The second chip, she admitted, had never officially been part of her mission. But she had suspected all along that a network this large could not have survived so long without someone with real access actively protecting it. Cross nodded slowly, understanding settling over her features, and asked about the 3 veterans who had died. Elena explained that Deputy Vance's office would now investigate each death individually, with enough documentation from the recovered evidence to reopen all 3 as potential homicides. Over the following weeks, the story unfolded exactly the way federal cases do, slowly, through layers of paperwork rather than dramatic single moments. Dr. Halden was convicted on multiple counts including deliberate medical negligence and conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation. His medical license was permanently revoked, and he was sentenced to 9 years. Frank Doss accepted a cooperation agreement in exchange for a reduced 5-year sentence. The procurement coordinator, Louise Byrne, who had quietly warned others and tried to disappear before agents caught her at a bus station, received 3 years after cooperating fully. Roland Fisk eventually pleaded guilty to 5 federal charges, including 2 counts of conspiracy connected to veteran deaths, in exchange for a reduced sentence that required his full cooperation with the broader investigation and permanent revocation of his security clearances. If you have made it this far into the story without pausing, comment the word loyal right now, because that is exactly what this kind of dedication deserves. And please subscribe so you never miss the next full story on this channel. The manufactured fraud charges against Renata Torres were formally vacated 6 weeks after Danny Cole's documentation entered evidence, a motion filed by Deputy Vance's office and granted without any opposition. Vivian Sharp's own past actions, the ones that had quietly shaped so much of this entire chain of events, went through a formal internal review, one that Elena learned would be judged in full context rather than through a predetermined outcome, which was the most honest promise anyone had been able to offer her. Walter Briggs was discharged from Ridgemont 4 days later, his infection finally responding properly to correct treatment, his wound healing the way it always should have from the very beginning. He walked out of room 318 under his own strength, fitted with a properly certified temporary prosthetic, arranged through a specialist with no connection whatsoever to the compromised supplier network. Before he left, he stopped at the nurse's station where Elena was finishing her morning documentation. He signed that he was leaving, and that he had been asked to testify in the upcoming proceedings against both Halden and Fisk. She told him she had been asked to testify as well. He asked if she was ready for that, for her operational history to become part of a formal, at least partially public record. She thought about it honestly, about what it would mean for the people who had spent 19 days dismissing her to eventually read some version of what had actually been happening the entire time. Yes, she signed. He reached out and offered his hand, not the automatic reflex of a hospital farewell, but a deliberate, considered gesture. She shook it. You never stopped being a lifesaver, he signed as he released her hand. Today, I was just your nurse, she signed back, and that was enough for both of them. He turned and walked down the hallway toward the elevator, and she watched him go the way she watched every patient leave who had finally healed the way they were supposed to. If this ending gave you chills, comment the word chills right now, and if you have not subscribed yet, this is genuinely the perfect moment to do it, because next week's story is going to hit just as hard. 3 weeks later, the broader story became public enough that local news picked it up, and then regional papers and eventually a national outlet ran a full piece on the fraud network, the corruption inside veteran hospitals, and the investigation that had finally broken it wide open. The article mentioned a contract nurse who had defied a senior physician's direct order to save a dying patient. It did not use her name. At the request of federal investigators, her identity stayed out of the public record for the length of the ongoing proceedings. But everyone on that 3rd floor at Ridgemont knew exactly who that nurse was. Bernice knew. Theo knew. The younger nurses who had once avoided her section of the floor knew, and had quietly started treating her documentation and her judgment very differently ever since. On a quiet Tuesday in early December, with the season's first real snow falling in slow, flat flakes outside the 3rd floor windows, Bernice slid a folded document across the counter toward Elena without a word. It was a formal offer for a permanent staff position, full benefits, a real salary, signed by the hospital's new administration and countersigned by the quality committee chair. Elena looked at it. She looked at the snow outside. She looked down the hallway, where Theo was patiently walking a patient through discharge instructions, slow and clear and not the least bit condescending, exactly the way he had learned to do it since that first difficult week. She looked at the floor around her, still imperfect, still occasionally frustrating, still entirely human, but slowly, carefully, becoming a better version of itself. She picked up the pen. She signed the offer. She handed it back without a word, and Bernice took it to the administrative file without comment, which by now was its own kind of understanding between them. Elena finished her shift, gathered her things, and walked toward the elevator one last time that day. As the doors began to close, she caught a final glimpse of the 3rd floor hallway. The ordinary, quietly healing life of a place that had been cracked open, examined, and was now slowly becoming something better than it had been before. She had spent 19 days there being dismissed, redirected, doubted out loud by people who had decided within an hour that she was not worth taking seriously. And in the end, none of that had changed the simplest fact of all. A person in pain needed someone who knew what to do and was willing to show up and do it, no matter who was watching, no matter who